The lights flickered in Calder Station's lower decks, casting uneven shadows across the grimy metal floors. Sector 8 had been neglected for years, its waste processing systems malfunctioning and leaving a permanent tang of salt, rust, and sewage in the air. The fluorescent tubes buzzed and sputtered overhead, occasionally plunging entire corridors into darkness before reluctantly sputtering back to life. Rain, Corman barely noticed anymore. The former ecological diplomat had chosen this forgotten corner of the station precisely because it matched his inner landscape, corroded, dim, and abandoned. He'd spent the last 3 years hiding in the shadows after the catastrophic failure of the Mayari Protection Treaty. The Kesson III negotiations had collapsed, and with them, an entire civilization. His quarters were Spartan, but meticulously maintained, a small oasis of order in the chaos of the lower decks. Rain had installed his own filtration system, and the module smelled faintly of moss and berries rather than the pervasive waste of the surrounding station. Still, the cold metal walls and low ceiling reflected his emotional state, confined, bitter, resigned. The only personal touch was a shelf of small containers, each holding a different soil sample. He collected them obsessively, remnants of planets he'd failed to save, each container meticulously labeled with coordinates and dates, memorials to his failures. Sometimes at night, he would open them one by one, breathing in the sense of worlds that no longer existed as they had once been. Rain was returning from the hydroponics bay, carrying his weekly ration of root proteins, when he heard the commotion ahead. A crowd had gathered near one of the drainage junctions, where the station's waste systems connected to the processing filters. Workers in stained uniforms were shouting and gesturing. "Don't touch it, too dirty." "Call security. We could get good credits for this one." "Careful, it might be diseased." Rain paused, then moved closer. His diplomatic instincts, long dormant, stirring slightly. Through gaps in the crowd, he caught glimpses of someone, huddled against the wall, a naked figure, covered head to toe in thick, dark mud. The smell hit him then, not just the usual station waste, but something organic, earthy, alien. "Look at those markings under the mud. It's a Mayari." One of the workers, a tall man with a shock of red hair, reached toward the figure with a prod stick. Slavers pay triple for live specimens since the purge. The hunched figure trembled, pressing further back against the wall. Through the layers of caked mud, Rain caught a flash of iridescent skin, blue-green with the distinctive swirling patterns of the Mayari people. "Stop!" The word escaped his lips before he could think better of it. The crowd turned, surprised by the intervention. Rain was known as the Hermit of Sector 8, the quiet man who never involved himself in station affairs. "Mind your business, diplomat." The red-haired man sneered the title. "Everyone knows you washed out after Kesson. This one's station property now, found in the waste ducts." Rain stepped forward, his heart hammering. 3 years of careful isolation shattered in an instant. "She's a sentient being, not property." "She?" the man laughed. "Can't even tell under all that filth. Too dirty to touch. But the slavers won't care once they clean it up." Rain moved closer, deliberately placing himself between the workers and the huddled figure. He could see her more clearly now, female. Yes, small-framed but with the characteristic elongated limbs of the Mayari. Her eyes, barely visible through the mud, were wide with terror. "Back away," Rain said quietly. There was something in his voice, an authority he hadn't used in years, that made several workers step back instinctively. "Security's on their way," someone muttered. "They'll sort this out." Rain knew what that meant. Station security worked hand in hand with the slave traders. If they arrived, the Mayari would disappear into the illegal markets that thrived in the station's shadowy economy. He shrugged off his jacket, a worn, once expensive diplomatic corps issue, and held it toward the trembling figure. "It's all right," he said softly. not in standard but in the fluid, musical language of the Miari. His pronunciation was rusty, but he formed the words carefully. "I won't harm you." The mud-covered woman stared at him, recognition flickering in her eyes at the sound of her native tongue. Rain took a careful step closer, still holding out the jacket. "This is ridiculous," the red-haired worker spat. "Security will have your module codes revoked for this. Corman!" Rain ignored him, focused entirely on the Miari woman. "Will you come with me?" he asked in her language. "Away from here?" For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with agonizing slowness, one mud-caked hand reached for the jacket. Rain didn't try to touch her, simply held the garment steady until her fingers closed around it. "Good," he said softly. "Can you stand?" The crowd murmured as the Miari woman shakily pushed herself to her feet, clutching Rain's jacket to her chest but not putting it on. She was smaller than he'd initially thought, her body nearly skeletal beneath the layers of mud. "Security's going to lock you both up," the red-haired worker threatened, but made no move to stop them, as Rain gestured for the woman to follow him. "Let them try," Rain said flatly. 3 years of diplomatic silence had built up a dangerous pressure inside him. In that moment, he almost hoped someone would try to stop him. No one did. The crowd parted reluctantly, faces twisted with disgust or calculation as the mud-covered Miari stumbled after Rain, leaving dirty footprints on the metal floor. Rain walked slowly, careful not to get too close, leading her through the dimly lit corridors toward his quarters. By the time they reached his module, alarm klaxons were sounding in the distance. Rain keyed in his entry code and ushered the woman inside, then sealed the door behind them, engaging the security protocols he'd installed during his more paranoid moments. The Miari woman stood in the center of his module, dripping mud onto the floor, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. She flinched when Rain moved toward the environmental controls, raising the temperature and activating the scent diffusers that released the subtle aroma of Miari forests, pine, moss, and water. "You're safe here," Rain said, still speaking her language. "I'm going to sit over here." He moved to a chair in the corner, deliberately putting space between them. "There's a cleanser in the alcove, if you want to use it." He gestured toward his small hygiene unit. "Food and water here." He pointed to the preparation unit. The woman didn't move, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "I know you understand me," Rain said gently, "but you don't need to speak. You don't need to do anything right now except breathe." Rain settled into his chair, deliberately relaxing his posture, making himself as non-threatening as possible. The woman remained frozen in place, mud drying on her skin, his jacket clutched in white-knuckled fingers. "My name is Rain Corman," he said after a long silence. "I used to work with your people, before." He trailed off, the memory of failure too bitter to voice. The Miari woman's eyes narrowed slightly at this, the first change in her expression since entering his module. Rain sighed. "I'll prepare some food. You eat when you're ready." He moved slowly to the preparation unit, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. He ladled rehydrated root stew into a bowl and placed it on the small table, along with a cup of warm water, then returned to his chair. The minutes stretched into an hour. Rain didn't push, didn't speak again. He simply waited, watching as the woman's rigid posture gradually began to loosen with exhaustion. Eventually, she took a hesitant step toward the table. Rain kept his eyes averted as she approached the food. He heard the soft sound of the cup being lifted, then the careful sip of water. A single word, so soft he almost missed it. "Surilvar." Rain looked up. The woman had taken another step back from the table, but she was looking directly at him now. "Surilvar," she repeated, a little louder. Then, in halting standard, "You speak of water, like mother tongue." "Yes," Rain nodded, careful to keep his excitement in check. "I learned from a Mayari diplomat many years ago." "Diplomat?" The woman's eyes clouded. "Before Purge." "Yes," Rain admitted. "Before the Purge, before I failed your people." She stared at him for a long moment, then turned away, moving to the far corner of the module. With deliberate movements, she spread Rain's jacket on the floor and sat upon it, her back against the wall, eyes fixed on him. Rain understood. She was claiming space, establishing a boundary. It was a start. "You should try to eat something," he said, gesturing to the untouched stew. "It will help." She didn't respond, but her eyes flicked toward the food before returning to him. Rain sighed and settled back in his chair. It would be a long night. The station's cycle lights dimmed, simulating night. Rain dozed fitfully in his chair, unwilling to retreat to his sleeping area and leave the woman alone in the unfamiliar space. Sometime in the darkness, he became aware of movement, the soft pad of feet across the floor, the careful sound of the bowl being lifted. He kept his eyes closed, feigning sleep as he listened to her eat. When the sounds stopped, he heard her return to her corner, the rustle of his jacket as she settled back onto it. Morning cycle brought the harsh glare of artificial light. Rain blinked awake to find the Mayari woman watching him, her posture slightly less rigid than the night before. The bowl on the table was empty. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Did you sleep?" She didn't answer, but her eyes tracked his movements as he stood and stretched. "I need to check something," Rain said, moving toward his console. "Station security will be looking for us. I need to see how much time we have." The console lit up under his touch, displaying security feeds and system access logs. Rain's expression darkened as he scanned the information. "They're already scanning the surveillance systems," he muttered. "Looking for us. For you." He glanced back at the Mayari woman. "We won't be safe here for long." She tensed visibly, her fingers digging into the fabric of his jacket. "I won't let them take you," Rain said firmly. "But we need a plan." He turned back to the console, fingers flying across the interface. After several minutes, he sat back, frowning. "They've locked down most of the transport bays," he said. "But there's a mining vessel scheduled to depart for Aguar 6 in 2 cycles. If we can reach it." A soft sound made him turn. The Mayari woman had moved closer, her interest apparently piqued by the mention of Aguar 6. "You know it?" Rain asked. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Moon, mining stop, trees, begin again." "Yes," Rain confirmed, surprised by her knowledge. "It was stripped for minerals decades ago, but they abandoned the operation when prices dropped. The ecosystem is beginning to recover." He studied her carefully. "Is that where you want to go?" Another hesitation, then, "Away, from here." Rain nodded. "Away from here. I understand." He turned back to the console. "We need to clean you up first. The mud makes you too conspicuous. And—" He trailed off, not wanting to offend. "Mud is protection," she said quietly. "Mother put mud. Hide scent. Hide marks. Hunters cannot find." Rain turned to face her fully. "Your mother covered you in mud to hide you from the hunters? During the purge?" The woman's face contorted briefly with pain. "Mother become bait, draw hunters. Say to me, be mud, be dead thing. Dead things not hunted." Rain felt a familiar ache in his chest, the weight of his failure pressing down again. "I'm sorry," he said, the words woefully inadequate. "What's your name? Your real name, not what your mother called you to hide." For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, softly, "Ilara." "Ilara," Rain repeated, careful to match the musical intonation. "It's an honor to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." A ghost of something, not quite a smile, flickered across her mud-caked features. "Better than dead. Better than slave." "Yes," Rain agreed. "Much better than those things." He gestured toward the hygiene unit. Will you clean now? The mud protected you, but now it makes you visible. Different. Alara glanced toward the alcove, then back at Rain, uncertainty in her gaze. I'll turn away, Rain promised, understanding her concern. I won't look. You'll have privacy. After a moment's consideration, Alara nodded. Rain turned his chair to face the wall, listening as she moved cautiously toward the hygiene unit. The soft hiss of the water atomizer activated, followed by the gentle hum of the sonic cleanser. Rain busied himself at the console, checking security feeds and plotting their route to the mining vessel. The station was vast, with countless service tunnels and maintenance shafts that didn't appear on official maps. As a diplomat, he'd never had reason to learn them, but 3 years of hiding had taught him more about Calder Station's hidden infrastructure than most of its engineers knew. The sound of the cleanser stopped, but Rain kept his back turned, waiting. Rain! His name in her voice, clear now, without the rasp of fear, made him turn slowly. Alara stood before him, transformed, without the layers of mud. Her true nature was revealed. Her skin was a deep blue-green, marked with intricate swirling patterns that glowed faintly with bioluminescence. Her features were delicate, large, almond-shaped eyes of deep violet, a small nose, full lips. Her hair, freed from the mud, fell in long, damp tendrils of silver blue down her back. She had wrapped herself in his jacket, which hung loosely on her slender frame. Her feet were bare, revealing the characteristic Mayari adaptations, slightly webbed toes that spoke of her species' semi-aquatic origins. Better? She asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Rain realized he was staring and quickly composed himself. Yes, much better. You'll still need proper clothes before we leave, but this is a good start. Ilara's gaze dropped to the floor. Thank you. For jacket. For not touching. You're welcome. Rain hesitated, then added, I worked closely with your people before. I understand your customs. Which people? Ilara asked, her head tilting slightly. Which world? I was stationed primarily on Kesson 3, Rain said, the familiar ache intensifying. I worked with the Mayari delegation during the protection negotiations. Ilara's expression sharpened. You know Nail? The name hit Rain like a physical blow. Yes, he managed. I knew Nile. She was the lead Mayari delegate. She was... He swallowed hard. She was brilliant, fierce, uncompromising. My mother's sister, Ilara said softly. My teacher. Rain closed his eyes briefly, the connection bringing fresh pain. I'm sorry, Ilara. I failed her. Failed all of you. The corporate interests were too powerful, and the Galactic Council too corrupt. I couldn't. He trailed off, old shame choking his words. When he opened his eyes, Ilara had moved closer, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. You tried, she said finally. Nile said in messages, human named Rain, who speaks with water voice, who fights for Mayari rights. Not hard enough, Rain said bitterly. Not effectively enough. Ilara's gaze didn't waver. You try now, with me. The simple statement hung in the air between them, both accusation and absolution. Rain nodded slowly. Yes, I'm trying now. Ilara seemed satisfied with this. She moved to the table and sat down, still clutching his jacket around her slender frame. Tell plan. How we leave. Rain pulled up the station schematics on his console. We need to get to Bay 17 in Sector 3. It's 4 levels up from here. He traced the route with his finger. These main corridors will be heavily monitored, but there are maintenance tunnels that run parallel. We'll use those. Ilara leaned forward, studying the schematics intently. When? The mining vessel departs in 26 hours. We should move tonight, during sleep cycle, when the corridors are less crowded. And then, Ilara pressed, Aguar 6, what there? Rain hesitated. Honestly, I don't know. It's abandoned except for automated mining equipment. The atmosphere is thin but breathable. There's water, and the beginnings of plant life. He met her gaze. It's nowhere, really. But it's away from here. Ilara nodded slowly. Nowhere is good. Nowhere has no hunters. That's the hope, Rain agreed. He hesitated, then asked, How did you end up here, Ilara, on Calder Station? Ilara's expression closed. Dark place, long journey. She wrapped her arms around herself. Many ships, many hands. Then water pipes, waste tunnels. Hide. Always hide. Rain didn't press further, recognizing the trauma beneath her fragmented explanation. You don't have to hide anymore, he said instead. Not with me. Ilara met his eyes. Something unreadable in her gaze. All Mayari hide now, or die. Not all, Rain said softly. There are rumors of survivors. Communities rebuilding on remote worlds beyond council space. A flicker of hope crossed Ilara's face before she suppressed it. Rumors, she repeated flatly. Hope, Rain countered. And sometimes hope is all we have. Ilara didn't respond, but some of the tension left her shoulders. She pulled Rain's jacket tighter around herself, then asked, Food? Rain smiled, the first real smile in longer than he could remember. Yes, of course. As he prepared another bowl of root stew, he was aware of Ilara watching his every move, studying him with the careful attention of someone accustomed to assessing threats. It would take time to earn her trust, but they had taken the first tentative steps toward something like understanding. The rest of the day passed in relative quiet. Rain checked the security feeds regularly, confirming his fears. Station security was conducting a sector-by-sector search. They were still focused on the lower levels, but it was only a matter of time before they expanded their search. Ilara spent hours examining Rain's collection of soil samples, carefully opening each container and breathing in the scents. When she came to the sample labeled Kesson 3, she held it for a long time. Her eyes closed. Home, she whispered. Rain, working at his console, glanced over. Yes, I collected it before the end. May I? Ilara asked, holding up the container. Rain nodded, unsure what she intended. He watched as she carefully tipped a small amount of the soil into her palm. With her other hand, she reached into the pocket of his jacket and withdrew something. A small, flat stone with markings etched into its surface. What is that? Rain asked. Memory stone, Ilara explained. Mayari tradition. Hold memories of important things. She pressed the stone into the soil in her palm, then closed her fingers around both. Stone remembers soil. Soil remembers home. Rain felt a lump in his throat. He turned back to the console, giving Ilara privacy for what was clearly a deeply personal ritual. After several minutes, he heard her replace the lid on the soil container. When he looked again, the stone was back in his jacket pocket, and Ilara was staring at him with renewed intensity. Why you keep soils? She asked. Many worlds. Rain sighed. Reminders of what was lost, of what I failed to protect. Punishment, Ilara said. Not a question, but an observation. Yes, Rain admitted. A kind of penance. Ilara considered this, then said something in the Mayari language too complex for Rain to follow. I don't understand, he admitted. Mayari saying, Ilara translated. Memory not for punishment. Memory for growing new life from old death. The words struck Rain deeply. He had been carrying these soils as burdens, reminders of his failures. Never had he considered them as seeds for something new. Before he could respond, an alarm on his console flashed red. Rain swore under his breath as he checked the security feed. They've expanded the search. They're coming to this sector. He turned to Ilara, who had gone rigid with fear. We need to move now, earlier than planned. Ilara stood immediately, survival instincts overriding fear. What need? Rain moved quickly around the module, gathering supplies. Food, water, portable comm unit. He pulled a small bag from a storage compartment and began filling it. And you need better clothes. He rummaged through his limited wardrobe, pulling out a simple jumpsuit. This will be too big, but it's better than just the jacket. Ilara took the offered clothing and retreated to the hygiene alcove to change. When she emerged, the jumpsuit hung loosely on her frame, the legs and sleeves rolled up several times. But it would serve. Good enough, Rain said, slinging the supply bag over his shoulder. He checked the security feed one last time, plotting their route. We'll take the maintenance shaft behind the environmental controls. It leads directly to the upper levels. He moved to the wall panel that concealed the station's environmental systems, sliding it aside to reveal a narrow crawlspace beyond. I'll go first, he said, dropping to his knees. Follow close behind. The maintenance shaft was cramped and dusty, dimly lit by emergency strips that cast everything in a sickly green glow. Rain crawled forward, painfully aware of Ilara's quickened breathing behind him. The tight space would be especially difficult for someone who had been trapped and hunted. Almost to the junction, he said softly, hoping his voice might provide some comfort. Just a little further. The shaft widened into a junction point where several maintenance tunnels converged. Rain sat up, giving Ilara space to do the same. In the dim light, he could see the strain on her face. Are you all right? He asked gently. Ilara nodded tightly. Keep moving! Rain consulted his portable display, checking their position against the station schematics. This way, he said, pointing to a tunnel that angled upward. It climbs 3 levels. The access will be tighter, but it avoids all the main security checkpoints. They continued their journey through the hidden infrastructure of Calder Station, moving steadily upward. The air grew colder as they approached the outer sections, and Rain could feel the vibration of the station's massive engines through the metal walls. After what seemed like hours, they reached a junction marked with faded symbols, indicating Sector 3. Rain paused, checking his display again. Bay 17 should be just beyond this access panel, he whispered. I need to check if it's clear. He activated the small camera probe he'd brought, sliding it through a crack in the panel. The feed appeared on his display, showing the dimly lit cargo bay beyond. The mining vessel sat on its launch pad, surrounded by stacks of equipment and supplies. 2 workers moved around the vessel, performing pre-launch checks. We need to wait, Rain said. There are still people there. Ilara peered at the display, her expression tense. How long? Until sleep cycle. Another few hours. Rain settled back against the tunnel wall. We should rest while we can. Ilara didn't look convinced, but she mimicked his position, drawing her knees up to her chest. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the distant hum of the station and the occasional clang of equipment from the bay beyond. Rain, Ilara said suddenly, her voice barely audible. You leave home. For me. Why? The question caught him off guard. This wasn't home, he said after a moment. Just a hiding place. Still, you had safety. Now danger. Her eyes searched his face in the dim light. Why help Miari, stranger? Rain considered his answer carefully. Because I've spent 3 years hiding from what I failed to do. When I saw you, surrounded by those workers, about to be sold. He shook his head. I couldn't hide anymore. Redemption, Ilara suggested. Maybe, Rain admitted. Or maybe just basic decency. Too little, too late. Ilara was quiet for a moment, then said, Not too late. For me. The simple statement hung between them, heavy with meaning. Rain felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the knot of guilt and shame he'd carried since Kesson 3. No, he agreed softly. Not too late for you. Their eyes met in the dim light, a moment of connection that transcended their differences. Then, Ilara looked away, her attention caught by something on Rain's display. "People leaving," she whispered. Rain checked the feed. The workers had indeed finished their tasks and were exiting the bay. "Good timing. We should wait a few more minutes to make sure they don't return, then make our move." They waited in tense silence, watching the empty bay on the display. When 10 minutes had passed without any sign of the workers returning, Rain nodded. "Let's go." He carefully removed the access panel, peering out into the bay before sliding through the opening. Ilara followed, her movements graceful despite the oversized jumpsuit. They crouched behind a stack of supply crates, surveying the area. The mining vessel was larger than Rain had expected, an older model designed for extended operations on resource-rich moons. Its hull was scarred and pitted from years of service, but the pre-launch sequence lights glowed steadily on its exterior panels. "We need to get aboard without triggering the security systems," Rain whispered. "The access hatch should be on the far side." They moved carefully from cover to cover, staying in the shadows as they approached the vessel. Rain was acutely aware of the security cameras mounted high on the bay walls, their sweep patterns illuminated by tiny indicator lights. "Wait," he hissed, pulling Ilara back as one camera swiveled toward their position. They pressed against a cargo loader, holding perfectly still until the camera continued its programmed sweep. "Now, quickly." They dashed the final distance to the vessel, reaching the access hatch without being spotted. Rain examined the security panel beside it, his heart sinking as he recognized the encryption protocol. "I can't bypass this," he admitted. "It's military grade." Ilara touched his arm, the first time she had initiated contact. "I can—" She pointed to a small symbol etched into the panel's corner. "Mayari Tech, base system." Rain moved aside, watching in amazement as Ilara manipulated the panel with practiced ease, her slender fingers dancing across the interface in patterns too quick to follow. After less than a minute, the hatch hissed open. "How did you—" "Later," Ilara cut him off, already slipping through the opening. "Inside now." Rain followed, pulling the hatch closed behind them. The vessel's interior was dimly lit by emergency lighting, the main systems in standby mode ahead of the scheduled departure. The air smelled of metal and machine oil, with a faint undertone of the minerals the vessel was designed to transport. "We need to find somewhere to hide," Rain whispered. "The crew will board before launch." Ilara was already moving down the corridor, her steps sure and silent. Rain followed, wondering not for the first time just who this woman was and what skills she possessed beyond those of a typical Mayari civilian. She led them to a maintenance bay near the vessel's core, where support systems hummed quietly. Stacks of equipment and repair parts lined the walls, creating numerous hiding spots. "Here," Ilara said, indicating a narrow space behind a bank of environmental regulators. "Heat masks, life signs." They squeezed into the tight space, the warmth of the machinery enveloping them. Rain checked his chrono. Still 4 hours until the scheduled departure. "We'll wait until they're in deep space," he whispered. "Then find a way to access the escape pods. We can use one to reach Aguar 6 when they pass within range." Ilara nodded, settling into the cramped space with surprising comfort. Rain tried to do the same, but the heat and confined area made it difficult. After a few minutes of shifting, he felt Ilara's hand on his arm again. "Be still," she said softly. "Breathe like water. Slow. Deep." Rain tried to follow her instructions, focusing on his breathing. Gradually, the discomfort receded, and he found himself sinking into a state of calm alertness. "How do you know about the security systems?" he asked after a while, keeping his voice low. "And ship layouts?" Ilara was quiet for so long that Rain thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, "Nile teach me, before purge. Say knowledge is survival." She was preparing you, Rain realized. She knew what was coming. "Yes. Saw corruption in council." prepared escape routes. Alara's voice held a mix of pride and grief. Taught me codes, systems, maps. Said, when hunters come, know how to run. The revelation added another layer to Rain's guilt. Niall had seen the betrayal coming, while he had continued to believe in the diplomatic process. She was right, he said heavily. I should have listened to her warnings. You listen now, Alara said simply. Now we run together. Before Rain could respond, the vessel's lights brightened, and the hum of machinery intensified. Voices echoed down the corridor, the crew boarding for departure. Earlier than scheduled, Rain whispered, checking his chrono in alarm. Something's wrong. Alara pressed a finger to her lips, then closed her eyes, concentrating. Rain watched as her skin's luminescence dimmed, the patterns fading until she was nearly invisible in the shadows. He tried to make himself smaller, pressing back against the warm machinery. Footsteps approached the maintenance bay, and a harsh voice called out, Check every compartment. Security says there might be stowaways. Rain's blood ran cold. They'd been discovered, or at least suspected. He felt Alara tense beside him, her body coiled like a spring. Nobody here, Commander. A second voice reported after a cursory inspection. Just equipment. Check behind the regulators, the first voice ordered. That's a classic hiding spot. Heavy footsteps approached their position. Rain met Alara's eyes in the dim light, seeing his own fear reflected there. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They were trapped. The stack of equipment hiding them was suddenly pulled aside, revealing a burly security officer in station uniform. His eyes widened as he spotted them. Found them, he shouted, reaching for his weapon. What happened next occurred so quickly that Rain would later struggle to piece it together. Alara moved with a speed and grace that seemed impossible, her body flowing like water as she lunged forward. Her hand struck the officer's throat with precision, and he collapsed, gasping. Move, she hissed, grabbing Rain's arm and pulling him from their hiding place. They burst into the corridor, coming face to face with two more security officers. Rain acted on instinct, grabbing a loose pipe from a nearby repair cart and swinging it hard. It connected with one officer's head with a sickening crack, dropping him to the floor. The third officer raised his weapon, but Alara was already on him, her movements a blur. She twisted the prod from his grasp and drove it into his neck, where it discharged with a crackling buzz. The man convulsed and fell. Run! Alara gasped, already sprinting down the corridor. Rain followed, adrenaline surging through his system. They rounded a corner and collided with a fourth figure, a tall, armored individual with the insignia of a slaver captain on his chest plate. The slaver's masked face turned toward Alara, recognition evident in his posture. The Mayari specimen, he said, his voice distorted through the mask's filter. Worth more than this entire vessel. He raised a weapon, not a prod, but a lethal pulse pistol. Rain didn't think, simply reacted. He threw himself forward, knocking Alara aside as the weapon discharged. Searing pain tore through his shoulder, but he continued his momentum, crashing into the slaver with all his weight. They went down together, grappling for control of the weapon. The slaver was stronger, his armor providing additional advantage. He slammed Rain against the floor, the pistol inching toward Rain's face. Diplomatic Corps washout, the slaver sneered. Playing hero? Rain struggled, his wounded shoulder screaming with pain. The pistol barrel touched his forehead, cold and final. Then the slaver jerked violently, his body arching backward. Behind him stood Alara, the prod she'd taken driven deep into a gap in his armor at the neck joint. The air filled with the smell of burning synthetic material and flesh. The slaver collapsed, his weapon clattering to the floor. Rain kicked it away, then struggled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder. We need to move, he gasped. There will be more. Alara was staring at the fallen slaver, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Rain, her eyes widening as she saw the blood seeping between his fingers. "You're hurt," she said, moving quickly to his side. "It's not deep," Rain lied, the pain nearly blinding. "We need to reach the bridge. Take control of the vessel." Ilara nodded, supporting him as they continued down the corridor. Rain's vision swam, his steps becoming unsteady as blood loss weakened him. "Left here," he managed, recognizing a navigation marker. "Bridge access." They turned the corner and found themselves facing two more figures, but not security or slavers. These were station workers in the dirty coveralls of maintenance crew, their expressions surprised rather than hostile. "Help!" Ilara said in standard, her voice clear and commanding despite the situation. "Slavers attack." The workers exchanged glances. Then the taller one stepped forward. "We know who you are," he said to Rain. "Former diplomat, living in the lower sectors." Rain tensed. Preparing for another fight he wasn't sure he could survive. "We're not with them," the worker continued, gesturing down the corridor where the slavers lay. "Not all of us support the trade." His companion nodded. "We've been sabotaging slaver operations when we can. Small resistance." Rain sagged with relief. Ilara's supporting arm, the only thing keeping him upright. "The vessel," he managed. "We need to launch. Get away." "It's prepped," the second worker said. "We can help, but you're bleeding badly." "Later," Rain insisted. "Bridge first." The workers led them through a service passage, bypassing the main corridors, where more security might be waiting. Rain focused on putting one foot in front of the other, the pain in his shoulder a fiery counterpoint to the cold, spreading through his limbs. The bridge was deserted when they reached it, the regular crew apparently delayed or dispatched elsewhere in the search for the stowaways. "I can pilot," the taller worker said, moving to the controls. "Worked these vessels for years before moving to station maintenance." His companion sealed the bridge doors, then helped Ilara settle Rain into a jump seat. "We need to stop the bleeding," he said, pulling a med kit from a wall compartment. Ilara took it from him, her fingers moving with the same precision she'd shown with the security panel. She cut away Rain's bloodied shirt, revealing the pulse wound, a charred, ragged hole just below his collarbone. "Not arterial," she murmured, more to herself than to Rain. "Clean." She worked quickly, applying antiseptic and a sealing gel that hissed as it made contact with the wound. The pain flared briefly, then subsided to a dull throb as the gel's analgesic properties took effect. "Thank you," Rain said, his voice weak. "Where did you learn?" "Survival," Ilara replied simply. She finished dressing the wound, then sat back on her heels, studying his face with concern. "You fool," she whispered, but her tone held no anger. "Why shield me?" Rain tried to smile, though it probably looked more like a grimace. Seemed like the thing to do. The vessel shuddered around them as the engines fired, the tall worker expertly manipulating the controls. "Launch protocols initiated," he announced. "Overriding station control. They're trying to lock us down." His companion joined him at the console. "Rerouting auxiliary power to shields. They might try to disable us before we clear the bay." Rain forced himself to focus through the pain and blood loss. "Aguar 6, he said. "We need to reach Aguar 6. "Already plotted," the tall worker confirmed. "It's only a few hours at full thrust. We'll get you there." The vessel lurched as it broke free of its moorings, the viewport showing the cavernous launch bay sliding past as they moved toward the massive bay doors. "Doors aren't opening," the second worker reported tensely. "Station control has overridden the bay systems." "Weapons?" the pilot asked. "Mining charges only. Enough to clear the doors, but we'd risk structural damage to the whole bay." Rain struggled to sit up straighter. "Do it. We have no choice." The pilot nodded grimly. "Deploying mining charges. Minimal yield. Targeted detonation." He worked the controls, and a moment later, a series of flashes illuminated the viewport as the charges found their targets around the bay door's locking mechanism. Metal shrieked as the damaged doors began to part, revealing the star-speckled blackness of space beyond. "Full thrust!" the pilot ordered, and the vessel surged forward, scraping through the partially open doors and bursting into the freedom of open space. Alarms blared as damage reports flooded the system. The vessel shuddered, systems fluctuating as the pilot fought for control. "Hull breach in the cargo section," the second worker reported. "Sealing bulkheads. We've lost some power couplings, but engines are stable." Setting course for Aguar 6, the pilot confirmed. "Maximum thrust. We'll be out of their effective weapons range in minutes." Rain sank back in the seat, exhaustion overwhelming him as the adrenaline faded. Alara hovered beside him, her hand resting lightly on his uninjured shoulder. "Rest," she said softly. "I watch." Rain wanted to protest, to stay alert until they were safely away, but his body had other ideas. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, and he surrendered to it. Alara's face the last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away. He dreamed of Kassan 3, not as it had been at the end, burning and dying, but as he had first seen it, vibrant, alive. The Miari communities thriving amidst the unique ecology of the planet. Nile was there, her dignified presence commanding attention as she guided him through the sacred groves, explaining the complex relationship between her people and the living world they inhabited. "We do not own the land," she told him in the dream, her voice musical and precise. "We are part of its story, as it is part of ours." The dream shifted, and suddenly it was Alara beside him, not Nile. They stood together on unfamiliar ground, barren but with tiny shoots of green pushing through the rocky soil. "New story," Dream Alara said, taking his hand. "Our story." Rain awoke to a gentle touch on his face. He opened his eyes, to find Alara bending over him. Her expression, a mix of concern and relief. "You wake," she said. "Good." Rain became aware of his surroundings. They were no longer on the bridge, but in a small crew cabin. His shoulder was professionally bandaged, and while pain still radiated from the wound, it was duller, managed. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. 6 hours, Alara replied. "We reach Aguar 6 soon." Rain tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his injury. Alara helped him, supporting his back until he was upright. "The workers?" he asked. "The ones who helped us?" "Pilot vessel. Prepare for landing." Alara handed him a cup of water. "Say they stay with vessel. Return to station with story of hijacking. Continue resistance work." Rain drank gratefully, the cool water soothing his parched throat. "Brave," he commented, "risking everything to help us." "Like you," Alara said simply. "Risk everything for Miari stranger." Their eyes met, and Rain felt again that connection that transcended their different species, their different experiences. In Alara's violet gaze, he saw not just gratitude, but something deeper, a recognition of shared purpose, shared pain. "Not stranger now," he said softly. Alara's lips curved in what might have been her first true smile since he'd found her. "No, not stranger." A chime sounded, followed by the pilot's voice over the comm. "Approaching Aguar 6. Landing in 20 minutes. You should come see this." Alara helped Rain to his feet, steadying him as he found his balance. Together, they made their way back to the bridge, where the two workers were guiding the vessel toward the looming moon, visible through the viewport. Aguar 6 was a study in contrasts. Vast regions of barren, strip-mined wasteland, interrupted by surprising patches of green, where nature had begun to reclaim the abandoned mining sites. Deep canyons cut across the surface, remnants of the intensive resource extraction that had once made the moon valuable. "There," the taller worker said, pointing to a relatively flat area near one of the green zones. "Old admin complex. Still has atmosphere generators and basic life support running on automated systems. Best place to set down." Rain stared at the approaching landing site. suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what they were doing. They were truly leaving everything behind, embarking on a new life on an abandoned moon at the edge of charted space. "It's not much," he said to Alara, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Just ruins and wilderness." Alara's expression was serene as she gazed at the approaching moon. "Perfect," she said softly. "New beginning, no hunters." The landing was rougher than ideal, the vessel's damaged systems making precision difficult. They touched down with a jolt that sent pain lancing through Rain's injured shoulder, but the pilot managed to keep the craft intact. "This is where we part ways," the taller worker said as the systems powered down. "There's an emergency supply cache in the admin building, standard protocol for mining operations. Should give you basic necessities until you can establish yourselves." His companion approached with a small package. "Medical supplies," he explained, handing it to Alara. "For his shoulder. And this." He gave Rain a compact communication unit. "Limited range, but if you get in trouble, it might reach passing vessels." "Thank you," Rain said, extending his hand. "Both of you. I don't even know your names." The taller man clasped his hand firmly. "Better that way. Can't reveal what you don't know." He nodded toward the airlock. "Atmosphere's thin but breathable. Temperature drops drastically during night cycle. The admin building should have environmental controls still functioning." They parted at the vessel's main hatch, the workers returning to the bridge to prepare for departure, while Rain and Alara gathered what few supplies they had and made their way outside. The air of Aguar 6 was thin and cold, carrying the metallic tang of mineral dust. Rain breathed deeply, his lungs protesting slightly but adapting. Beside him, Alara seemed to have no difficulty, her Mayari physiology perhaps better suited to the variable conditions. They watched as the mining vessel lifted off, its engines leaving a trail of ionized particles in the pale sky. When it had disappeared from view, the silence was absolute, a silence unlike anything Rain had experienced on the crowded, noisy station. "Come," Alara said after a moment. "Find shelter before dark." The admin building was a low, bunker-like structure of prefabricated panels designed to withstand the moon's occasional dust storms. Its exterior was weathered and stained, but the sealed doors responded to the emergency access codes the workers had provided. Inside, emergency lighting flickered on automatically, revealing a space that had been abandoned in haste. Desks still held defunct datapads. Walls displayed faded mining charts, and personal items lay scattered where they had been left years ago. The air was stale but warm, the environmental systems humming efficiently despite their age. Rain sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted again, the events of the past days catching up with him. Alara moved through the space with purpose, examining controls, opening storage compartments, familiarizing herself with their new home. She found the emergency supplies, preserved food packs, water purification tablets, basic medical equipment, and survival gear. "Rest," she told Rain, returning with a thermal blanket. "I explore more." Too tired to argue, Rain allowed her to arrange the blanket around him, then watched through half-closed eyes as she continued her methodical exploration of the facility. There was a confidence to her movements now that had been absent on the station, as if each step away from Calder had restored something essential to her being. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, Alara was gently shaking him awake. The quality of light had changed, dimmer now, with the reddish tinge of Aguar 6's sunset filtering through the dusty windows. "Found something," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "Come see." Rain followed her through the building to a section he hadn't noticed before, a large domed chamber attached to the main structure. As they entered, he realized what it was, a hydroponics bay, designed to provide fresh produce for the mining operation. Most of the equipment was dormant, but remarkably, in one corner, a small section remained active. Pale green shoots grew in orderly rows, fed by a trickle of nutrient solution from a system operating on minimal power. Life, Ilara said simply, gesturing to the plants. Waiting. Rain moved closer, examining the resilient vegetation. Some kind of moss hybrid, he noted. Engineered to produce oxygen and filter toxins. Standard terraforming precursor. Can grow more? Ilara asked, her expression hopeful. Yes, Rain said, an idea taking shape. And not just this. I have the soil samples, seeds from a dozen worlds, with the hydroponics equipment and the right adaptations. He looked around the chamber with new eyes. We could create a sustainable ecosystem here. Small at first, but expanding. Ilara's face lit with the first full smile he had seen from her. New life. New world. It won't be easy, Rain cautioned. The conditions are harsh, resources limited. Not easy, Ilara agreed. But possible. She met his gaze steadily. Together. Possible. That night, they made a simple meal from the emergency rations and settled into the most intact section of the admin building. A former supervisor's office with a relatively comfortable couch and functioning climate controls. Rain's shoulder throbbed dully, but the medication from the medical kit kept the pain at manageable levels. Ilara sat cross-legged on the floor. Rain's jacket, which she had refused to relinquish, draped across her shoulders despite the warmth of the room. In her hands, she held the memory stone, turning it over and over, her expression distant. What are you thinking? Rain asked softly. Ilara looked up, seeming surprised by the question. After a moment's consideration, she said, Thinking of Mother, of Nail, wondering if they see me now. What would they think? Of this place, of our choice? Ilara's fingers stilled on the stone. Mother would say, alive is victory. Niall would say. She paused, a small smile touching her lips. Niall would say, make something new from ashes. Rain nodded, understanding. That's what we'll do, then. Make something new. Yes, Ilara held out the memory stone. For you. Rain hesitated. I can't take that. It's your connection to your home, your family. Home gone, Ilara said simply. Family gone. But memory remains. She continued to hold out the stone. Take. Keep safe. Promise. Recognizing the importance of the gesture, Rain carefully accepted the stone. Its surface was warm from Ilara's touch, the etchings catching the light as he turned it. What does it say? The markings. Old Mayari phrase, Ilara explained. Moment before trust becomes touch. Rain looked up, meeting her gaze. And what does that mean? Means. Ilara seemed to search for the words. Means place between strangers and friends. Place between fear and love. Sacred moment when choice is made. Rain felt the weight of the stone in his palm, heavier than its physical mass warranted. Thank you, he said softly. I'll keep it safe. I promise. Ilara nodded, satisfied. She rose fluidly and moved to the couch, settling beside him with deliberate care, mindful of his injury. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the soft hum of the environmental systems and the occasional ping of the building's metal exterior adjusting to the falling night temperatures. Why you help me? Ilara asked suddenly, returning to the question she had posed earlier. True reason. Rain considered deflecting again, but found he couldn't. Not with Ilara so close, her violet eyes searching his face for truth. Because when I saw you, he said slowly, covered in mud, terrified, surrounded by people who saw you as a thing to be sold. I saw everything wrong with the system I once served. Everything I had failed to fight hard enough against. He paused, gathering his thoughts. And, because in that moment, helping you was the only thing that made sense in a universe that had stopped making sense to me a long time ago. Ilara absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. Not redemption, she said after a moment. Connection. Yes, Rain agreed, surprised by her insight. Connection. With slow deliberation, Alara reached out and took his hand, the one not holding the memory stone. Her skin was cooler than human normal, the faint luminescence of her natural patterns, creating soft patterns of light between their joined fingers. Connection, she repeated softly. Good reason. Rain felt something shift between them, a barrier dissolving, a distance closing. He closed his fingers gently around hers, careful not to presume too much, allowing her to set the pace of this new understanding. We should rest, he said eventually. Tomorrow will be a long day. Much to do. Alara nodded, but made no move to release his hand or increase the distance between them. Instead, she leaned her head against his uninjured shoulder, her silver blue hair cascading across the fabric of his shirt. Rest, she agreed, her voice already heavy with approaching sleep. Then build new world. Rain allowed himself to relax. The warmth of Alara's presence beside him, more comforting than he would have thought possible days earlier. As sleep approached, he found himself thinking not of the past, of failures and regrets, but of the future, of green growing things in the hydroponics bay, of a small sanctuary carved from the barren moon, of a life rebuilt from ashes. The days that followed established a rhythm, a shared purpose that bound them together, even as they learned the boundaries and contours of their new relationship. Rain's shoulder healed slowly, the pulse weapon's damage more extensive than it had first appeared. Alara changed his bandages daily, her touch growing more confident, less hesitant. They expanded their domain gradually, venturing further from the admin building to explore the abandoned mining complex. Most of the heavy equipment had been removed when the operation shut down, but smaller tools remained, many still functional despite years of disuse. In the hydroponics bay, they transplanted the resilient moss to larger growing containers, supplementing the nutrient solution with compounds Rain formulated from his knowledge of ecological systems. Alara proved to have an innate understanding of growing things. A cultural memory, she explained, from the Mayari's deep connection to their native ecosystems. Rain's collection of soil samples became their most precious resource. Each container held not just soil, but microorganisms, spores, and dormant seeds that, with careful nurturing, might adapt to their new home. They started small, moss and lichen first, then simple grasses, working toward more complex plants as their confidence grew. Water was their greatest challenge. The mining operation had tapped into subsurface ice deposits, but the automated pumping systems had long since failed. Rain and Alara spent days repairing a single pump, working together in companionable focus, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed tools back and forth. When they finally activated the repaired pump and water flowed into the collection tanks for the first time, Alara let out a sound of pure joy, a trilling note that echoed in the cavernous pump house. Rain found himself laughing in response, the sound strange to his ears after years of solitude and bitterness. Alara turned to him, her face alight with triumph. Without warning, she stepped forward and embraced him, a quick, fierce hug that was over almost before Rain registered what was happening. She stepped back immediately, her expression uncertain, as if she had surprised herself as much as him. "Water," she said, gesturing to the flowing liquid as if to explain her outburst. "Life." "Yes," Rain agreed, still feeling the ghost of her touch. "Life." That night, as they shared their evening meal in what had become their common room, Alara spoke more of her past than she ever had before. She told Rain of her childhood on Kesson III, of her mother's work as a water engineer, of Nail's diplomatic missions that took her off-world for months at a time. "I study water systems," she said, explaining her familiarity with the pump technology. "Before Purge, trained to maintain sacred springs. You were an engineer," Rain realized. Like your mother. Beginning engineer, Ilara corrected. Still learning when hunters come. She described the day of the purge. The corporate security forces descending on the Mayari settlements with barely a warning. Her mother, pushing her into a mud pit, covering her with a thick clay that would mask her life signs from scanners, whispering "be dead thing" before running to draw the hunters away. I stay in mud 3 days, Ilara said, her voice steady despite the horror of the memory. Then dig out, find others dead, walk to spaceport, hide in cargo, ship to ship, place to place, always hiding. Until Calder Station, Rain said softly. Until you find, Ilara corrected. Until you see me, not just mud. The simple statement carried such weight that Rain found himself without an adequate response. Instead, he reached across the table and took her hand, as she had taken his days earlier. Her fingers curled around his, cool and strong. I see you, he said simply. Ilara's luminescent patterns brightened slightly, a Mayari blush. Rain realized. She didn't pull away. That night, for the first time. Ilara didn't retreat to the separate sleeping area they had established for her. Instead, she curled beside Rain on the wide supervisor's couch, her back pressed against his side, her breathing evening into sleep almost immediately. Rain lay awake longer, acutely aware of her presence, of the trust implied in her choice. Eventually, lulled by her rhythmic breathing and the unfamiliar sense of peace it brought, he too slept. The weeks became months. The hydroponics bay flourished under their care, expanding from the initial small section to fill the entire dome. They adapted the mining facility's solar collection arrays, bringing more systems online as their power capacity increased. The trickle of water from the repaired pump became a steady flow, allowing them to create irrigation channels to the outside world, where they had begun experimental plantings in the lunar soil. Their living space expanded and evolved. They converted adjacent rooms into a proper living area, a kitchen space, a workshop. Rain's soil samples, once kept as relics of failure, became the foundation of their seed bank, a catalog of possibility rather than a memorial to loss. Ilara changed too. The fearful, mud-covered woman from Calder Station was gone, replaced by a confident, purposeful being who moved through their growing domain with the grace of someone truly at home. Her standard improved rapidly, though she and Rain often spoke in the Mayari language, his fluency growing under her patient tutelage. Their relationship evolved in slower, more subtle ways. The casual touches became more frequent, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing away a strand of hair, sitting close together as they planned the next day's work. They slept side by side now without question, finding comfort in each other's presence. They didn't speak of it, this growing connection between them. It simply was, as natural as the plants taking root in the lunar soil. 6 months after their arrival on Aguar 6, Rain stood at the edge of their experimental field, watching as Ilara knelt among the new growth. They had successfully transplanted a hardy grain from Rain's Altarian soil sample, and the first shoots were pushing through the regolith, pale green against the gray-brown of the lunar surface. Ilara wore a garment she had fashioned from salvaged fabric, dyed with pigments extracted from their greenhouse plants. Her silver-blue hair was longer now, woven with small beads fashioned from polished pump components, practical and beautiful at once. She sang softly as she tended the plants, a Mayari growing song, her voice rising and falling with the ancient rhythms. Watching her, Rain was struck by how far they had come from that moment in Calder Station's waste junction. How unlikely their journey had been. How precious the life they were building. Ilara looked up, sensing his gaze. She smiled, a full, radiant expression that still caught Rain by surprise when he saw it. She rose and walked toward him, her steps light despite the low gravity. The Altarian grain takes well, she said, reaching his side. Strong roots already. Like us, Rain said without thinking. Ilara tilted her head, studying his face. Yes, she agreed. Like us, strong roots, new soil. She took his hand, a familiar gesture now, and led him back toward the admin building. The setting sun cast long shadows across their path, the temperature already beginning to drop as night approached. Inside, their home was warm and welcoming, illuminated by lights they had rigged from mining lamps and decorated with weavings Ilara had created from processed plant fibers. The air smelled of the herbs they had cultivated, of the bread-like substance they had learned to make from their first successful grain harvest. They prepared their evening meal together, moving around each other with the ease of long practice. Rain noticed that Ilara seemed quieter than usual, a slight tension in her movements that hadn't been there earlier. "Is everything all right?" he asked as they sat down to eat. Ilara looked up from her plate, her violet eyes meeting his. "Yes," she said, "and no." Rain waited, giving her space to continue in her own time. "I carry something," she said finally. "Something growing." Rain's brow furrowed in confusion. "You mean a new plant species? Something from the greenhouse?" Ilara shook her head, a small smile touching her lips. "No. Inside me." She placed a hand on her abdomen. "New life. Our life." Rain stared at her, comprehension dawning slowly. "You're pregnant? But I didn't think. We're different species." "Not so different," Ilara said softly. "Mayari and human. Compatible sometimes. Rare, but possible." "A child," Rain breathed, the concept both terrifying and wondrous. "Our child." Ilara nodded, watching his face carefully. "Are you pleased?" Rain moved around the table and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Pleased? Ilara, I'm—" He struggled to find words adequate to the moment. "I'm overwhelmed, honored, terrified, joyful." Relief washed over Ilara's features. "I worry," she admitted. "Many months I know, but afraid to tell. Afraid you think burden, not blessing." "Never a burden," Rain assured her, squeezing her hands gently. "A miracle." He reached up and touched her face, tracing the luminescent patterns that swirled across her cheekbones. In all their months together, through all the casual touches and sleeping side by side, he had never quite dared this level of intimacy. Ilara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them again, they held a depth of emotion that took Rain's breath away. "I love you," he said simply. The words he had held back for so long, finally finding voice. "I have for— I don't even know how long." "Since Calder," Ilara said with certainty. "Since you say I won't harm you in Mayari tongue." "Was it that obvious?" "To me? Yes." Her smile deepened. "I love you since you bleed for me. Since you take Slaver's bullet meant for me." Rain stood, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. She came willingly, fitting against him as if they had been designed as complementary pieces of a whole. Her luminescence brightened, casting a soft blue-green glow between them. "What do we do now?" Rain asked, suddenly aware of how unprepared they were for this new development. "We should expand the living quarters, create a space for the child, and medical considerations. I don't know anything about Mayari prenatal care or hybrid pregnancies." Ilara pressed a finger to his lips, halting the flow of words. "Now," she said softly, "we plant seed." She took his hand and led him outside, into the cool night air. The stars burned overhead, brilliant in the thin atmosphere, illuminating the experimental field where their first crops grew. From a pocket in her garment, Ilara produced a small container, one of Rain's original soil samples. He realized. The label read, Kesson 3. "Last soil from home," she explained. "Save for this moment." She knelt on the ground at the edge of the field, and Rain knelt beside her. With careful movements, Ilara scooped a small depression in the lunar soil. She opened the container and poured a portion of the Kesson 3 earth into the hollow. "From my hand," she instructed, holding out the container. Rain understood. He took a pinch of the soil and added it to the depression. Ilara then reached into another pocket and withdrew a seed, large and iridescent, unlike anything they had planted before. "Sacred tree," she explained, "grows by Mayari temples. Mother, give me before." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Before the purge, before everything ended. Together, they placed the seed in the mixture of soils. Ilara sang softly as they covered it, a different melody than her usual growing songs, more solemn, more reverent. When the planting was complete, she turned to Rain, her expression serene in the starlight. "New life," she said, touching her abdomen. "New world." She gestured to the field around them. "New story." She leaned forward and kissed him. A gentle, perfect meeting of two worlds. Rain pulled her close, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the mud and waste of Calder Station to the star-lit expanse of their own creation. From isolation to connection. From loss to renewal. "Our story," he agreed softly. They remained there, holding each other under the vast sweep of stars, as the seed of their future took root in the soil of their shared past, a promise of life continuing, evolving, persisting against all odds. Too precious to touch, yet touched and transformed nonetheless.